From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
10 days to go until a government funding deadline and still no deal. We'll talk about the to-do list in a busy lame duck session with Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina, whose state stands to receive millions in disaster relief money.
Another day of meetings on Capitol Hill for several of Donald Trump's cabinet picks, including Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard. We'll have more on the transition, including Donald Trump's new promise of fast permits for those investing $1 billion in the U.S. We'll have more with our political panel.
And Israel sends troops deeper into Syria after the fall of the Assad regime. Jane Harman from the Commission on the National Defense Strategy joins later this hour on what comes next. Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday evening as we consider what comes next in Syria and in the wider Middle East. Joe, of course, it's not just up to this current administration to deal with. It will likely be something inherited by the Trump administration, and not just the president-elect, but those who he has nominated to serve key roles in it that could shape foreign policy and military policy, two of whom were spending their time in the Senate today.
That's right. The beginnings of a national security team, and you've heard us talk about them before. Among the more controversial, certainly according to their critics and many Democrats on Capitol Hill, the more controversial picks. Kaylee, Pete Hegseth back on Capitol Hill with more meetings today, and Tulsi Gabbard, day two of her meetings with senators who will decide her fate.
And Hegseth, of course, does seem to have his prospects improved at least somewhat by a positive meeting with a key senator of Iowa, Ernst, yesterday. Her colleague, Republican Senator from Texas, John Cornyn, weighed in on that earlier today.
The founders never believed that there would be a rubber stamp. So I respect the fact that Senator Ernst has met with Mr. Hegseth twice now and said that she will support him through the process. We'll see how that turns out.
Are you ready to support Pete Hegseth?
I will support Pete Hegseth, as I always say, barring any unforeseen circumstances.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson at the table here in Washington. Wendy, this has been a really interesting beat to follow here, and Joni Ernst seems to have really turned the tide on behalf of Pete Hegseth. Many folks saw her essentially sinking his nomination. She seems to be keeping it alive right now.
She really does. And it sort of reminds me of Lindsey Graham, who was once a never Trumper and then evolved into someone who will occasionally say something. Maybe there's a question about this nominee, but ultimately always goes with what Trump wants. Joni Ernst got a lot of social media pressure. She got a lot of MAGA world pressure. She got threatened with a primary. And despite the fact that she is a female combat veteran, something Pete Hegseth doesn't want to exist, and a victim of or survivor of sexual assault, yet she is, putting aside these allegations until she says she hears something on the record with someone with a name behind it, and looks like she's going to support him. I mean, something else could still come out that changes her mind, but it kind of seems to me like Matt Gaetz, the man who was nominated for Attorney General and then withdrew when the senators just said, no, this is a bridge too far. It seems like maybe he was the sacrificial lamb, and now Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, RFK Jr., the sort of more controversial nominees will eventually get their jobs because they've taken their pound of flesh, if you will.
Well, and then there's the question of the job they will be asked to do, not just them, but others who have been named to positions in a second administration based off of what the president-elect wants, which could be dictated perhaps by True Social today. This afternoon, he posted on True Social that anyone who invests $1 billion in the U.S. will get easier, more expedient permitting, perhaps waiving of environmental questions. He ended that True Social post with, "Get ready to rock." How easy is it going to be to rock in this way, Wendy?
Well, it's so typical Trump and so unclear and sweeping. And, one thing Trump doesn't seem to believe is that the devil is in the details. He just wants to say these things and get them out there, and somebody else will figure that out. And those people would be Chris Wright, the nominee for Energy Secretary, and Doug Burgum, the nominee for Interior Secretary. We'll have to figure out, and Lee Zeldin for EPA, we'll have to figure out sort of how to make this work. But he says anyone. Does that mean a foreign government? Does that mean a foreign adversarial government? who is anyone who has $1 billion and in any kind of field? I mean, we don't know. He's just saying right now, pretty much, give us $1 billion and we'll speed this through. One of the other problems is expediting the permitting process. Mm-hmm. This is something that presidents and members of Congress of both parties have wanted. It takes too long to get things done in this country, and that is why we lag behind so many of our allies and adversaries. However, getting that unstuck is a real process. Trump tried it in his first term. Mm-hmm. Others have tried it. Barack Obama tried it. We'll see if, as Trump likes to say, the deep state or just Washington will give up any power, which it is usually loath to do.
Yeah, that red tape, quite sticky. Yeah. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you so much. Now, Israel hit hundreds of targets on military sites in Syria today in the aftermath of the toppling of dictator Bashar al-Assad's regime, which has raised questions about the future of the Syrian government. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken weighed in on that today, saying in a statement, quote, "The transition process and new government must uphold clear commitments to fully respect the rights of minorities, facilitate the flow of humanitarian assistance to all in need, prevent Syria from being used as a base for terrorism or posing a threat to its neighbors, and ensure that any chemical or biological weapon stockpiles are secured and safely destroyed. The Syrian people will decide the future of Syria." Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisco. So, Michelle, he says the Syrian people will decide the future, and yet I would imagine the U.S. is very carefully watching this future and may in some way try to shape it, at the very least, to make sure there's no resurgence of ISIS.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you hit on it right there. The biggest concern is the possible resurgence of ISIS. The U.S. hitting targets on Sunday with its own strikes, so some 75 airstrikes for just that purpose. So clearly trying to get ahead of any uprising from those groups, but also watching vigilantly at this new administration in Syria, whatever you might call it, as it's being formed. There's multiple rebel groups that are vying for power, even though HTS is the one who ultimately landed the ouster in Damascus. And so they're watching very carefully. But you see there where Secretary Blinken is trying to lay out the parameters that the U.S. is watching in order to kind of give the okay that this administration can move forward and be a government for the Syrian people.
Israel has been busy moving troops across the border and beyond the buffer zone for the first time in 50 years. They're claiming to have sunk the entire Syrian Navy. What is next for Benjamin Netanyahu here?
Well, it's very interesting, and going back to the U.S. position on all this, they don't want to kind of speak for Israeli operations, as they haven't in the Israel-Gaza conflict or any other layers of this wider war. And I think they've got a lot to handle right now. I mean, we saw how when the ceasefire came about with Hezbollah, there was some relief on the part of the Israelis that, okay, now we can focus on one front at a time here. But this has thrown everyone for a whirl. The Syria conflict has complicated things beyond belief, and certainly in the U.S.'s mind, you hear Biden himself citing support for Israel and Ukraine as a positive for turning the balance of power in the Middle East and trying to firm up his legacy as a new incoming administration comes in with a much more isolationist policy. Biden is saying, hey, look at what we've done to support these allies that has led to regime change in key areas of the Middle East.
Even as Netanyahu takes credit for reshaping the Middle East. Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisco. Thank you so much, Michelle. Coming up on Balance of Power, Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina will join us live to talk about the approaching deadline for government funding and disaster relief. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We've got to take care of the border as a top priority, and we will. We've got to get the economy going again, and we will. Part of that is ensuring that we don't have the largest tax increase in U.S. history on the American people at the end of this coming year when those Trump tax cuts expire. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time. The sequence and the use of reconciliation is really important. There are thoughtful discussions going on right now. They will be all day. President-elect Trump and I will be talking about this in depth this weekend before the Army-Navy game.
The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, clearly a lot to figure out still, speaking earlier today on priorities for the 119th Congress, the incoming administration, and, of course, how the party wants to approach the process of budget reconciliation. These are big questions, but we also remind you there's a lame duck session to finish. and the government is set to run out of money in 10 days. Joining us from Capitol Hill Live is Republican Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina. Congressman, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining. What's the solution so we can move on to bigger things here, to this funding expiration? We've got 10 days to figure it out. Do you kick the can until March?
Yeah, I think we're going to end up doing a short-term CR until March. There's a lot of things that we need to do, Joe. We have disaster relief that we need to deal with. You know, I'm in the eastern part of North Carolina, but I've been over to the west, which is absolute devastation. We need to help the infrastructure. We need to help our farmers. There are a lot of things that we need to do before the end of this session, and I feel very confident we're going to have to get that done. It'll have to be through a CR, though.
Is that disaster relief going to amount to something close to what the White House has asked for, in the ballpark of $100 billion?
Yeah, Kayleigh, there's a lot of stuff in there that, as usual with our Democratic colleagues, they love to throw in a bunch of wish lists. And the Speaker and a lot of other individuals have started to go through this list, throwing things out that really are not related to disaster relief. We, again, have to be responsible to the taxpayer, but at the same time deliver the relief and the aid that people who have experienced the disasters need. We don't need to go funding projects unrelated to this issue.
Well, let's move on to the new Congress here and the magical word of reconciliation, Congressman, because that brings opportunity for the majority, even a very thin one, as Republicans will have in the House. What's your thought on sequencing here, and are we even having the right conversation? There seems to be a choice between border first or tax cuts. Why not do both?
Well, we can do both. We've been working, Chairman Smith, on Ways and Means. We've been traveling around the country. We've had tax teams over the last 6-10 months diving into this issue and looking what happened in 2017 and what can we carry forward. How do we do that best? What policies worked? Maybe what policies didn't work as well for the American people. We want to put together a pro-growth tax policy that allows the country to grow, allows taxpayers to keep as much money as possible, at the same time making sure we keep an eye on our deficit and our debt, rather, and making sure we're being good stewards of that looming problem that's happening in the country at the same time. That said, you know, the border, President Trump could fix so many things, and he will on day one. Same thing with energy. You know, the Senate, Senator Thune was talking about a two-bill approach or a two reconciliation approach. We're trying also to think about one, getting it done in an efficient manner that way.
Well, and if it is to be done in the first 100 days, which the president-elect has expressed a desire to see his 2017 tax cuts extended by the time that marker is reached, the majority is going to be incredibly thin, perhaps just a vote of one. How hard is just that majority going to make getting this done in an expeditious manner, whether it's one package or two?
Yeah, Kayleigh, it's going to be difficult. I won't, blanch that at all. It's going to be very difficult. We have a lot of folks that want the SALT issue revisited, revised, and taken care of. You know, I don't know why, the federal government has to bail out blue states, but I think it's an important item.
But President-elect Trump expressed support for that during his campaign.
Yeah. Well, it depends upon, I don't disagree. It depends upon what that support means. Do we go back to pre-2017 where it was not an issue at all? Or do we increase the limits to just something that's a little bit more palatable for some of the more conservative members? I think there's a lot of threading through the eye of the needle that needs to be done, but there's no time to waste. We need to get to this. There is something that we need to do as immediately as we can and try to get people who maybe have some differing views on where the tax package needs to go at the table sooner than later so we can hash this out.
You do wonder what some of the added ideas might mean for simply extending or making permanent the 2017 tax cuts. You add no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, SALT. I think some members like yourself might be wrestling over. Doesn't that make it more difficult to get the base legislation through?
It does, Joe. I'm not going to say it does not. The tax on tips was a huge issue that the president and even the vice president talked about in her race, looking at Social Security, looking at some of the other things to try to free up money for Americans. We have to look at this carefully, though. We're, again, Ways and Means, we're kind of the committee that really has great stewardship over the tax dollar. How do we best affect these policies to help the American people, but at the same time be the best stewards to the American taxpayer?
Well, and when we consider other sources of revenue, the president-elect at least has argued that some of the offset of lower tax rates could be the fact that he would like to tariff imports into the United States at a higher rate. But as we talk about the kind of being responsible to the American taxpayer, the American consumer, that could result in higher costs for them. So what is the appropriate tariff tax balance here in your mind, Congressman?
Sure. And I think that's a valid concern, Kayleigh. I don't personally think tariffs should be used as a revenue source. I think they should be used as a negotiating tool when we have folks in other countries that are not acting in the best interest of the American people. And that, President Trump has shown his nimble way of dealing with those individuals. We don't want to raise prices in this country. We don't want to increase inflation, which is the real issue of what's going on in the economy now. That said, again, threading this needle is going to be difficult, but I have every faith in the members who are going to be at the table working through this to try to make sure it's good policy for America and good policy for the American taxpayer.
Congressman Murphy, there's an interesting process going on next door in the Senate right now as the process of confirming Donald Trump's picks for the cabinet get underway here. We're, of course, not at the point of having hearings yet, but we're learning a lot more about some of the people who he has tapped. And I'll remind our viewers and listeners that you're a physician. You have MD stamped on your congressional website. And there are a lot of questions about the approach that RFK Jr. is taking to traditional medicine. Are you comfortable with some of the alternative ideas that he's brought forth? His concerns, for instance, about some vaccines, his concerns about obesity drugs that have been quite the rage recently. Are those changes needed, or are they to be avoided?
Well, looking at things totally, there are some issues that I do not agree with RFK on. But what I think is good is the fact that we're going to disrupt the decades-old legacy of thoughts that A plus B always equals C. It's okay to question things in medicine. It's okay to question things in science. We saw during the last 4 years, especially with Fauci during the pandemic, that they threw politics into this. This is what's happening in our medical schools now, throwing politics into science. So it's okay to question some of the things that have gone on in effort to spark good, objective debate. Are we going to agree on everything with JFK? I don't think so. But it's okay, again, to have somewhat for disruption for a good reason to bring that in as part of the discussion.
And just finally, sir, are you not concerned at all about vaccines specifically and the questions it could raise around the science and efficacy of them as we consider long-term public health?
Sure. Absolutely, Kayleigh. And, prior to the pandemic, it was a well-understood, statement throughout all of medicine that vaccines were to be used for at-risk populations. And even Fauci said that at the beginning, then he changed his mind. And this is where RFK is pulling off of this. Sadly enough, because Fauci did so many things to push vaccines, which I was a promotion of, but only for individuals who are at risk. Now the CDC is pushing the COVID vaccine for kids 6 months and older. I think that's absolutely absurd. And so what's happened is a great amount of vaccine hesitancy, even for things for polio, even things for measles, which in my opinion have to be part of our childhood vaccine question. But again, it's good. We have to get the trust back of the American citizen and the American patient back in American medicine. And I think this is a healthy way to do it.
All right, Dr. and Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Still ahead, Trump vowing faster permits for anyone investing $1 billion in the U.S. Bloomberg's Jennifer Dlouhy will be with us to find out what it would actually take for that to become reality. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We've had tremendous foreign direct investment. And yes, we've definitely tried to make, clean the brush out. So there's to help diminish the burden from permitting and things like that. And there's more to do in that space. If the Trump team is serious about trying to clear some of that brush, sure. But one thing I hear too often from him and them is, without regard for any impacts of some of the guardrails that are there for a reason.
was Jared Bernstein, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden White House, of course, speaking earlier today in response to Donald Trump's vow to expedite permits for any person or company that invests at least $1 billion in the U.S. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Jennifer Dlouhy. Jennifer, it's great to see you. Welcome back to the table. I didn't think we'd be talking about this, but the problem is I guess I'm not sure what we're talking about. We saw the post on Truth. He says, "Get ready to rock," with 3 exclamation points. What does that mean?
It's all up to us to determine, I think, at this point. I mean, look, this is a social media post. It is not a detailed policy plan. And yet we know from Trump's history a little bit about what he's going for here. He's clearly indicated a preference for expediting big projects, particularly energy projects. That was a feature of his campaigning for the presidency. But it's also something he tried in his first term, and he's not alone. President Biden has also tried to expedite permitting. Former President Obama also tried to expedite permitting. It's just very difficult for presidents to do this in a meaningful, long-lasting way unilaterally.
Well, and in part, I would imagine that's because it needs congressional action, and therein lies a hiccup oftentimes. But to what extent could you get around this by just appointing regulators, like, say, Lee Zeldin at the EPA, who just don't enforce the existing regulations? If you're not suing anyone, you just kind of let things go. Do the regulations really exist at all?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think we're talking about 2 things here. One, you can do some stuff administratively. You can put a shot clock on agencies, trying to get them to move faster. You can identify high priority projects and say these are going to move through the system a little bit faster, get to approvals. That's what all 3 presidents have tried to do to some degree. What you're talking about is another feature of this, which is where the regulatory agencies can, in fact, expedite things. They can do quicker reviews. They can maybe say some regulations don't apply. I mean, we are expecting, of course, many of the regulations that apply to the kinds of projects that Trump is saying he wants to prioritize to be eased, just as they were during Trump's first term. There was an effort during Trump's first term to limit how much states could block projects that had a water pollution risk. That was effective for a few years. It was rolled back under Biden. But that's the kind of thing we could see done again by these agencies.
You just brushed up against something important, and that's energy. That's what we're talking about here, basically, is we're talking climate regulations, likely in energy applications. That's where we're going here.
I mean, I think we're talking about environmental reviews broadly, whether it's climate or conventional impacts. I mean, the U.S., essentially, if you're a big project developer, and Trump knows this well as a real estate developer, you've got to get so many permits, you've got to clear so many reviews, and a lot of them are tied to a 1970 environmental law that says any federal nexus, any project that has a federal nexus, it's an airport, it's a solar array, an oil well on federal land, that those have to go through this level of scrutiny. And so really that's right now, there's a big emphasis on getting the energy that we need. That's Trump's priority here.
All right. Bloomberg's Jennifer Dlouhy, thank you so much for joining us as we try to read between the lines here on Truth Social. We'll have much more ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There are so many things said about Kash Patel that are either patently untrue that he can point to or way out of context. So I just think as he's meeting with members, talk about what he's going to do in the Department of Justice, how he's going to reform it, how he's going to be fair, how his past experience is relevant. Those are the sorts of discussions Kash will have, and I think most of the conversations will be successful.
Republican Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina talking about his meeting with Trump's pick for FBI Director Kash Patel. Joining us now for more on the confirmation prospects for Patel and Trump's other nominees, this evening's political panel. Ashley Davis, founding partner at West Front Strategies and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Alvin Jordan. Welcome to you both. Patel obviously has been making the rounds on the Hill, as has Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth this week. And Hegseth in particular has focused a lot of his energy on one senator, and that would be Joni Ernst of Iowa, who, of course, is a combat veteran herself. She's put out some, I will say, lukewarm statements that at least leave the door open to a pathway for confirmation for him. Ashley, how do you think she ultimately comes down on this?
Well, I think my tone's going to be much different tonight than it even was last week, because I felt like he was definitely in the ICU last week. But it seems that with President Trump coming out this weekend, I guess, and really putting his endorsement behind him and telling him to continue to fight. I think that all of these candidates, and we were talking about this earlier, that are not on life support anymore. I think he made this decision to support his nominees, and if he doesn't, and you've seen it everywhere, people saying it, that he'll look weaker. So if you have 4 people that you've nominated not be able to get through confirmation, that's not a good thing. So I think he's doubling down. I think Joni's, Senator Ernst, has definitely changed. I think there's also the concern that people will primary these people to, these senators and House senators that are up for election in 2 years, and so they're going to give these guys a fair shot.
Well, that's what I'd like to hear more about is the pressure campaign on both sides. We know that Joni Ernst is getting a lot of heat from MAGA world to allow this hearing to happen, and we've seen this play out. But look at the other side. Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, having to justify why they're even meeting with Pete Hegseth. Is just the new par for the course in the confirmation process?
It's a whole new ball game.
I
think actually, I do. I think as the president-elect comes out and makes it very clear that these are confirmations that he still wants to happen. Even like the small nods to him alluding that he was proud of how Pete Hegseth was fighting, and I think some of the softer stances, even from the Democratic side, I think show that everyone will kind of get to kind of put their bona fides on the table and get a, quote unquote fair shot, as it were. And so, yeah, I think we'll see more of this as we get closer to it. And if there is any opposition, I don't know that we'll kind of hear it from a public facing standpoint. It'll definitely be something that is, a conversation for closed doors.
Well, and when we consider what could happen in the public, do Democrats want all these individuals to get to the hearing stage? They want that tape, potentially?
Yeah, I don't think they have a choice, and I think that if there's any potential infighting, that they'll let it kind of self-implode on its own. I mean, similar to how we saw the Matt Gaetz nomination kind of, go away pretty quickly. And so I think it's beneficial to them to kind of just keep their head down and let this play out. And if there's any infighting, definitely let that kind of be the surround sound as opposed to it coming from the Democratic side of things. I think it's kind of not my circus, not my monkey.
I also think this is like a little bit of putting their stance down on who's going to win some of these fights in regards to the president and the Republican Senate. So if he continues to just, bow down to the Senate, I think that that's going to be an issue. But also, we were also talking about that some of these moderate Democrats that are in swing states are also going to maybe have to be concerned about their election. So Georgia, for example, there's several that may actually vote for some of these nominees.
So thinking like Ossoff here.
Yeah,
yes, mainly.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, to that conversation, a lot being kind of with the look around the corner to elections to come, and I think that will definitely help position a lot of what we hear coming out from some of these camps.
Well, we're going to be talking about RFK Jr. next week. It looks like Bloomberg News making that report. He's got a meeting on the calendar with Tommy Tuberville. That's where it's going to start here, the senator from Alabama. Now, we just talked to Greg Murphy about this, a physician who, as a Republican, Trump-supporting Republican, expressed concerns about some of RFK Jr.'s views when it comes to vaccines, particularly, I think, was what the doctor congressman was referring to. What's this going to look and sound like, having gone through Matt Gaetz and in the throes of Pete Hegseth now?
I mean, this is where I feel like the real show starts, because how unpredictable is RFK. And I do think that, to your point about just letting this all kind of play out in the hearing itself, I think some of these meetings, whether it be, kind of preliminary thoughts that come from it, but for the most part, I think Democrats, at least from the perspective of, how this will go, will definitely want RFK to kind of sit and say his piece, as it were, and let it, kind of speak for itself as far as where it will go. And I think we could, of course, get fireworks, or, if it is, of the milder temperament as far as what's delivered or what's uncovered during these hearings, I think that will only be beneficial to the Republicans in that way. So we'll see.
Well, I think there's going to be a couple of Democrats that vote for RFK, though.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. Sanders, for example, has already said he supports or thinks he can support him. Senator Cassidy, this is the committee that it's going through. One of the committees, he has to go through 2 committees, Finance and Help. Cassidy will chair Help. He is already being primaried for senator by a, MAGA right former congressman. So
sounds like you see all 3 of these getting through.
Well, the last week I was like, we all know we don't know, right?
Well, there's still weeks to go before these hearings actually begin, so no one really knows what could surface. There are some people, though, that do seem like, barring something incredibly unforeseen happening, or a shoo-in for confirmation, could get a lot of Democratic votes, even like Senator Marco Rubio, for example, who met with Chuck Schumer today. Then it becomes a question of filling his seat. And Ashley, there's been a lot of reporting about the idea that Lara Trump, who just resigned as co-chair of the RNC, could get it if DeSantis acquiesces to the president-elect's potential wishes here. Does there need to be some deal-making in Florida for this to happen?
My money's on her. First of all, I think I didn't know much about her before this election. I actually think she did a fantastic job. Obviously, when everyone heard it was the daughter-in-law, I was like, oh, really? But she did a really good job. I have nothing but positive things to say about her. And I'm assuming that Governor DeSantis probably doesn't want to pick a fight with the incoming president. So we'll see what happens. Because I heard the lieutenant governor was maybe an option. But when DeSantis was maybe going to be the
defense secretary as a backup for Hegseth.
Well, that's the thing. So we've got this big football game coming up this weekend. And I remember when Mitt Romney had dinner with Donald Trump about 4 years ago, and everybody thought he was on the verge of getting a big job. It looked like it was a setup after the fact. So Ron DeSantis agrees to put Lara Trump in the Senate. Pete Hegseth continues on. He gets nothing in the Defense Department, just a photograph from the Army-Navy game. Is that how this ends?
Sometimes. I know. I think Hegseth, I think he has a greater shot than he did last week, and that's all you can hope for in this kind of back-and-forth saga, that's for sure. But maybe a picture will help.
Maybe it will.
I thought you were talking about the Steeler game.
Well, and that's not the only thing that we understand is going down at the Army-Navy game or before it. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said he's going to have a sit-down with Trump to talk about that reconciliation process. Yeah. Football and political footballs.
Big time.
Moving around.
And the House is now staying. They just announced that they're going to stay that weekend after they're sworn in. So I guess they're sworn in the 3rd. So that 4th to talk about reconciliation. I think it's going to be fast and furious, but not tax reform at the beginning.
Well, we're going to have to get more into that later. Ashley Davis and Alvin Jordan will be back with us for more on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Janet Yellen, the first woman to head the U.S. Treasury, sits down for an exclusive interview with Bloomberg's David Gora as she prepares to leave office. Tune in Wednesday at 10:30 Eastern Time, only on Bloomberg.
There was a joke about making Canada the 51st state. Were people laughing? Has this been reflected properly in the media? Donald Trump with this AI image of him with the Canadian flag. We're kidding, right?
Well, I think so. It feels like you're kidding.
Wait a second.
We could also make the United States the 11th province if you want. I mean, there's two ways that this can go.
Burn. Part of my conversation with Kirsten Hillman, Canada's ambassador to the United States. Just last week here on Balance of Power, following Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's meeting with President-elect Trump at Mar-a-Lago, the big dinner. This morning, Donald Trump tweaking Trudeau on social media, quote, "It was a pleasure to have dinner the other night with Governor Justin Trudeau of the great state of Canada. I look forward to seeing the governor again soon so that we may continue our in-depth talks on tariffs and trade," unquote. Back with us, our political panel, Ashley Davis and Alvin Jordan. I guess a sense of humor is important here. Neither of you are laughing. Is this just Donald Trump being Donald Trump, Ashley?
Oh, I think this was very on purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he's getting under his skin. Obviously, everyone remembers they do not have a lot of love lost between the two of them, obviously, because Trudeau's on life support, so to speak, right now. Obviously, probably by the end of 2025, he will no longer be Prime Minister of Canada. And so he's doing everything he can to make amends with, obviously, or try to work with President Trump. I mean, I just think if you see what's happening in the energy space in regards to what the president wants to do, President-elect wants to do in regards to whether it's the Keystone Pipeline, whether it's energy independence for North America. I mean, you have to have a government there that's going to be able to work, and they're more conservative than we are in regards, I don't know if conservative is the right word, but they're more restrictive on permitting and things like that in Canada than they are in the United States. So I think there's going to be a lot of leadership change in Canada where you'll have a lot more flexibility within the next year.
Well, there are reasons to discuss permitting today, but before we get there, just on this Truth post about Trudeau in particular, is this not a commonplace strategy we see from Donald Trump? Because there are things he wants to be able to get Canada to do when it comes to the flow of both people and drugs over the northern border. It's why he threatened tariffs, but diminishing the opponent, if you will, is also part of the playbook.
Yeah, 1,000%. And I think the fact that we're talking about a second term, you can even see in the response from, any of the officials I think that we've heard commentary from is, playing that fine line of being able to, quote unquote, take the joke, but also not be a pushover. And I think they'll find their pockets of being able to, say what they truly feel or truly mean, while also smiling and shaking the hand and taking the picture at the same time. And I think that's kind of the strategy that you have to employ to both, not set President Trump off, but also still be able to, make some progress on whatever the particular deal is. So I think we'll see a lot of smiling and head nodding and, kind of the real work happening after the picture is taken.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because when we spent time with the ambassador, she talked about how much fun it was to be on the patio at Mar-a-Lago. The kids were running around. She said everyone was dressed up. She said Donald Trump walked them to their car, shook hands, they had hugs. Is this just the way foreign leaders need to prepare to interface with this president-elect?
Yes, and I think, everyone always underestimates Donald Trump, or used to at least, but I think he's crazy like a fox. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that Trudeau is in the place of weakness right now. Yep. But you also have this independence recently over the last couple of years that the provinces have their own power over some of their natural resources. So you have someone like the premier in Alberta who's very forward-thinking, so to speak, that she has pretty much been very pro-U.S., trying to make sure that her borders are closed in regards to Alberta, really pro-energy, working with a lot of our governors in many states. And so, Danielle Smith is probably the future of Canada, and Trudeau is probably the past, in my opinion.
So as you talk about energy and raised permitting earlier, I do want to ask you about the Truth Social post, another one from Donald Trump today. Anyone or any company investing $1 billion in the U.S., essentially, to summarize his words, gets a fast-track permitting process, waive those environmental regulations as well. Let's rock, or get ready to rock.
Get ready to rock.
Ashley.
Yes.
Thoughts?
So I had lots of thoughts that went through my mind. There's very few states, and North Dakota's actually one. So Governor Burgum,
the new Interior Secretary.
With new Interior Secretary, the energy czar, where they actually have more control than the federal government of their permitting system. Most states, have their own permitting system. So if you're a Democrat in Pennsylvania, for example, is Josh Shapiro just going to roll over to all of the permitting that he's talking about? Obviously, there's other parts of the permitting that are federally run that President Trump will have control over in regards to EPA and others, but it's a little difficult, and there's probably going to be a lot of lawsuits, I would think. Right. But it's,
prepare the lawyer.
Are you ready for the rock and roll, Alvin? That's really the question.
We're going to have lots to talk about the next 3 years.
We're going to be rocking. But so what are we talking about here? This is drill, baby, drill. What about NIMBY? I thought that we lived in this NIMBY nation.
My whole question is, what does investing mean in December of 2024? What actually is...
You just send a check for $1 billion.
Right. So I think it just opens up the floodgates for a whole lot of, obviously fodder here at the desk, but also I think, there will for sure be some approaches with $1 billion or billions of dollars to see, what, loopholes or doors we can have open for some of these to pass through. Just get your popcorn ready is what I would say.
Oh, it's been popped for a while now. Joe and I are hiding it under the desk. We'll have more with Alvin Jordan and Ashley Davis coming up here on Balance of Power. So stick with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington with our remaining moments in our political panel. Ashley Davis and Alvin Jordan with us at the table with 10 days and counting. You know, we haven't put up the countdown clocks yet. No one's using the word shutdown. No. Nothing to see here. Move right along. Are we sure Democrats are going to play along with Speaker Johnson whenever this stopgap does emerge in the coming days?
Enough to keep the government afloat, for sure. I don't anticipate there being. As I say this, unless there's something that comes out of left field completely. I don't see there being kind of any major roadblocks to keeping the government open, at least as far as the tea leaves are going at this point.
Well, and then it becomes a question of for how long will this kicking of the can be kicked down the road. Ashley, if it's ultimately to March, once again, we'd find ourselves halfway through the current fiscal year before we've actually appropriated for it, and they're very quickly going to find themselves with another appropriations fight for the next year. Why kick the can at all?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think that the president-elect said early on that he would rather do it with all Republicans next year, but it's going to be very difficult. We have to also lift the debt ceiling. So we have to lift the debt ceiling, do the first or whole reconciliation package, and we're going to have these appropriations bills. The speaker was saying today that it's probably not going to be a Christmas tree, which means that a lot of different issues get added onto it. So the year-end package. So there'll probably be like a farm bill extension and things like that. But this could be a pretty clean CR through the end of March, and which just sets up. When you saw how often they're going to be in session next year, I feel like our lives are over.
Yes.
We'll see how long they work on Fridays. So I feel like I've heard this.
We spoke a little bit earlier with Greg Murphy about disaster relief funding. President Biden asked for a lot. It's about $100 billion. Does that get attached to this CR? Will it all go through?
I don't know if I don't know that it will go through, but I do think that now is obviously the time to try to get that pushed. I mean, so much has been made about the lack of funding, and so I think from a Biden administration standpoint, even if it does not, there's no negative mark, kind of left on the administration as like a last push to try to get some of this funding out. But and then if it doesn't, I don't think that it'd also be one of those things that is just a continued conversation. So, I don't think the full amount will be passed through, but it's at least worth a shot if you're the Biden administration, that's for sure.
Well, and of course that's. Ashley, sorry, did you have a thought?
No, I was just going to say, I'm hearing it's going to be maybe not the 100, but like around 90. You have too many states. I mean, look at the Republicans in North Carolina. You have to get this passed. The issue is just the offset. Disaster funding usually doesn't have to be offset in regards to the House or Senate passing something, but there are some Republicans that are more on the fiscally conservative side that want it offset. But I think it's going to be attached to the CR. There's too much devastation in some of these states.
Yeah, we shouldn't lose sight of how devastating that they were this fall in the lead up to the election. As we consider as well other must-pass legislation, the NDAA text finally came out this weekend. Of course, it passed through the House Rules Committee. They will vote on it, I'm assuming, some point this week. And yet it's managed to piss a lot of people off. Those who are defense hawks don't think it's enough money at nearly $900 billion. But then there's also progressives who are upset with some of the language in it around transgender members of military families. How hard is it going to be to get to the requisite amount of votes on this thing, Alvin?
I do think that this one will take a bit of back and forth, but ultimately I feel like, the funding will win out and the language will be, they'll be able to kind of parse it down to what's acceptable for most parties. Again, I really don't feel like any of this is going to, kind of come to a head in a way that, it blows up any deal in that way. And so I look for him to find some compromise on the language and the money. I feel like will be or the funding will be where it should.
You've got a 14% raise for junior enlisted troops. You can't vote no on that. Right?
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
And they pre-conferenced the bill, so I'm always a big believer on any deal that if everyone's a little mad, it means it's good.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So, I mean, this is how
that what your Twitter feed looks like?
This is how I negotiate. So if anyone's so you have, as you pointed out, both sides a little unhappy, but this is a must-pass bill that there's no way that they can't. And I actually think the House takes it up I mean, who knows? But they take it up this week and leave, and then the Senate just passes it, and that at least is done. And then they do the CR, the Farm Bill, and disaster funding as another package.
And then they call it a
we
year.
Just got the whole roadmap with Ashley
Everyone's
now.
tired.
Yeah. This has been productive. You just told us how it's all going to work.
Well, yeah, because I said,
and no one side is too happy right now, so it's got to be right exactly where it should be then. If that's how we're
so no one's happy and everyone's tired. Washington is amazing. Ashley Davis and Alvin Jordan, thank you both so much for joining us and for your daily dose of happiness and energy. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
That's right. No need for a doom scroll. Big thanks to our panel. That was a great conversation. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. We will do this again tomorrow. See you back here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.